This week we're going to continue with 1 Peter part 3. We looked earlier at the introduction. This is the theme of salvation. God's mercy is extended to us, and then the thing of holiness, which is not just outward, but it works from the inward to the outward. And now the third great theme that we're going to be approaching it from is submission, healthy, holy submission in the workplace and in the home place, especially today. So, Lord, help us to learn the beauty of a life that's in tune with you and the example that Jesus gave in this area. Now, Peter listed a few outward indicators of holiness that we know there are things that are not evidence of holiness, things that are, but he doesn't go into much detail on them. 1 Peter 1:14-15 says, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct." Chapter 2, verse 1, "Put away all malice and deceit, and hypocrisy and envy and slander." And 4:3 says, "For the time is past, that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry." But he doesn't offer any more discussion about those particular sins. He instead devotes the whole last half of chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3 to an area of holiness, which I really think is the heart of it all. It's coming into obedience to God with our wills, and specifically as that is evidenced in our submission to the authorities, people that God has placed in leadership over us in our lives to direct us, to protect us, to develop us. And so to start with, I just want to build a little basis for this. Next week we'll be looking at it more, but Jesus didn't come to do his own thing. We're not here to do our own thing. Healthy submission is about doing God's will instead of our own. Jesus is our example in relation to the Father and also in relation to others whom he dealt with on the earth that were in positions of authority. So Philippians 2:4 says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." I want to say, if you only have your interests at heart, you're going to struggle with submitting to the will of anybody else. If my greatest interest is the eternal salvation of people around me, then my goal no longer is to get my own way. The reason I don't want anyone to tell me what to do is because I think I'm more important, and my plans should take precedence. My desires should be everyone else's priority, and if those don't happen, then I'm frustrated. I don't want to lay down my will. And I'm somebody important. Well, you're somebody, all right, somebody that blocks the way for others to come to God. Submission is a great means by which God can shine his light through us to lead others on the pathway to him. Philippians 2:5-7 says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." Have a mind in your heart, in yourself, which is like Christ Jesus. He took upon him the form of a servant. A servant is somebody that does the will of somebody else. They're submitted to someone else. Verse 8 says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." He submitted to the will of God, and he submitted to the government institution, religious institutions that were here upon the earth in the course of his life. But he left the throne of heaven to become a nobody, trying to tell everybody that there's a Father who longs to welcome you home. That's what the cross is about. Obedience. It's about submitting my will to the will of God. The evidence of my will being submitted to the will of God is reflected in my attitude to the earthly people he has placed over me. People that may have less experience and knowledge than I have, people that are rude, inconsiderate, unappreciative, and even downright wicked, people that stretch me and give me an opportunity to become more like Jesus every day in my attitudes and actions. And most of all, people who need my light to shine into their darkness. Jesus' example of submission to earthly authorities was evident even in his childhood. Luke 2:51 says, "And he went down with them, came to Nazareth, and was submissive to them." That's after he just got done astounding the elders in the temple and with his great knowledge and insight. He didn't come home and say, well, now that that's established, I'll be calling the shots around here. I'm going to be in charge. No, he came to Nazareth and he was submissive to them. Colossians 3 is part of the teaching on submission in the family, but it says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So sometimes in youth ministry, I've asked kids who are frustrated with their parents, are you smarter than Jesus? Do you think you could gain what you need to in life without being under the authority that God has placed over you and alongside you? So the fact is, God has placed people in our lives that are imperfect, but they're there by his authority, and ultimately to recognize God's authority is to recognize the authority of those people in our lives that he has placed to develop us. And so 1 Peter 2, let's get into it now. 1 Peter 2:13 and 14. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. It wasn't just that Jesus was submitted to the Father or to his parents. He submitted himself to evil government authorities. And we will talk more about that next week. We're going to look at these two verses. But this week, submission, holy, healthy submission in the workplace and in the home place. 1 Peter 2:18 says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So how does God expose our self-preoccupation, our penchant for getting our own way, and our focus is upon temporary things of this world? He does it by putting us into contact with other difficult, selfish people who push our buttons. Those people that we talk about that are so incompetent even and even evil. Submission means allowing that person in authority above me to make mistakes. You know, if you've been on a job and they sit in their ivory towers, don't have a clue how things work out on the floor and are making decisions and just frustrate you to no end, well, let them make mistakes. You're not the one that's responsible for the company. They are. Maybe they'll learn. Maybe they won't, but to place the responsibility upon yourself. And same thing in a marriage. A wife needs to allow her husband to make mistakes when he is obviously heading the wrong way, but refusing to listen. How else is he going to learn? It's difficult to be under submission to people that seem so unable to lead and guide and don't have a sense of what's even going on at times. But verse 21 says, to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered from you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That's the secret of being able to fully submit and do it in the right way, is that we commit ourselves to God. Jesus knew when he was hanging on the cross, it was not just the result of some evil people, but God had a higher purpose than Jesus' comfort and safety and reputation. His plan was for salvation for the world. We get mad because our will is thwarted and things are not going the way I want. Well, maybe the Father is trying to teach you some of the lessons that'll help you to become like Jesus, because he experienced all those things too, but he did it without sin. And he kept his tongue. How do you talk about the people that are in authority over you? How do you talk to the Lord? In your grumbling and complaining? Or do you say, thank you, Jesus, that here's an opportunity for me to learn Christian character and to develop in my patience and in my meekness, which are precious things in the sight of God, as we'll see here. 1 Peter 3:1, and this is the other thing beyond the workplace, is the home place, and it dwells here in this passage specifically about wives. It says, wives, be subject to your own husbands, submit to them. That is a clear Bible pattern starting in Genesis 3 and continuing on throughout the New Testament. And so what does headship, what does submission mean for a wife and her husband? Well, it means that her attitude is going to impact her husband. If he's not a believer, that he can become a believer. That's what it means. And it results in a marriage relationship that'll be healthy. I tell young brides to be in premarital counseling, if you undermine the authority of your husband, you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt the marriage. And as you'll see as we look here, I am not talking about people that are just rude and obnoxious and declaring that because I'm the head of the family, things are going to go my way. Far from that. But there needs to be an attitude. It says here in here in 1 Peter 3 that so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. As I've been saying, meekness and submission is not becoming a doormat, just gets walked all over, but it's becoming a doorway. I've talked about, what is a wife to do when her husband forbids her to go to church. Maybe he's an unbeliever and doesn't like the fact that she's going, and she can just reject his authority and go anyhow, or she can grumble and complain. But what if her husband feels like he's rejecting her and neglecting him in order to be at church every time it's open? What if he feels like she is considering herself a righteous, holy person and her husband is some scum of the earth because he's not a Christian? No wonder he doesn't want her going to church and hearing about that stuff. But if she comes to him and says, you know what, I believe God has placed you in the place of headship in our home. I'm going to trust him to use you to lead me and guide me and protect me. And she has this spirit of appreciation and respect. I doubt if he's going to forbid her to keep going to church if that's where she's learning these things that are so amazing to him. Verse 3 says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight very precious. And it's going to be precious in her husband's sight as well. The way that she's going to be attractive to her husband is not by outward clothing and makeup and things like that. It's the inward that really is going to strike his heart, and certainly it impresses God. So she has this attitude that I acknowledge God has placed you there to cover, protect, and love me, instead of I'm going to compete with you for the headship here. When she submits in that attitude, it makes all the difference in the world. Verse 5 says, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves. Notice they were hoping in God, not in their husbands, but they adorned themselves by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Submission for a wife is basically faith that God is working through her husband to accomplish what is best for her. And the words of the husbands follows that. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. In that culture, this was a huge statement that they are equal as heirs of Christ. And when it says weaker vessel, I don't understand all what that means, but I think what it's trying to convey is your wife needs to be protected. And this biblical view of headship is especially elaborated on in Ephesians chapter 5, and the beautiful passage there about Christ laying down his life for the church as her head. But the point is that a wife is going to be recognizing the headship, respecting the authority of a man that is imperfect. Abraham was not a great protector. We're reading here about Sarah and Abraham. He was not a great protector, as we'll see here in a minute, which helps to confirm that our submission to people is not based on their character, but it's based on God's character. That he's going to watch over you and protect you as you, in the holy and healthy way, submit to that person. When Abraham was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarah, his wife, this is Genesis 12, verse 11, said, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with you because of me, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Now, Sarah actually was his half-sister. In the bloodlines closer to the original creation, apparently that was permitted. Centuries later, when the law was given at Mount Sinai, it prohibited that. But it was legal for him to marry his half-sister at this time, and so he asked her to submit to him in this thing. She might have thought, great protector you are, why should I submit to you? And there are certainly times when a wife should not submit to her husband, when it compromises moral integrity and convictions of her heart and so on. We'll talk about that perhaps more, but in this case, she went along with it. So when Abram entered Egypt, verse 14, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. This is a 65-year-old lady, by the way. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Why should she submit to him? Well, maybe she didn't have any choice where else she was going to go, but she did go along with him. And the Lord protected her. Verse 17, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. You'd think that Abram would learn his lesson. You think that husbands would learn their lessons when they mess up. But 20 years later in Canaan, she's 85 years old and still attractive to King Abimelech. And so Abraham makes the same mistake. Verse 20, chapter 20, verse 2 of Genesis, and Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Did he not say to himself, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. Later on, when he found out what was going on here, because God appeared to him in a dream and warned him. And he said, she told me she was his sister. But in the integrity of my heart, the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. True, holy, healthy submission can only happen when you believe there's a higher authority than whoever seems to be in charge of you here on earth. Jesus knew that the Father had not been usurped by the religious leaders or the Roman governor. His final word on the cross, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. He submitted to the will of God. He said in the garden, not my will, but yours be done. And that released the soldiers to come and carry him off. Now, when we read that Sarah called Abraham, calling him Lord, there in 1 Peter 3:5, if you weren't familiar with the Old Testament, you might picture a weak, spineless, overly dependent woman who never expressed her opinion. But in Genesis 16:2, now as a background to this, they knew that the promise of God was that they would have a child and that a great nation would be descended through him. But it's gone for decades and that has not happened yet. So she figured out a scheme and she shared with her husband. Verse 2 of Genesis 16, Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children from her, by her. And the Lord and Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. One translation, the same word is translated elsewhere as obey. Abraham obeyed the voice of his wife. Now, he should have run it by the Lord before he did that, but it seemed logical, and it gave him an opportunity to go in there to Hagar and have a child, which would, in the culture of the day, would become their child. But so this woman that's held up as the example of godliness and submission, she wasn't totally a lady that never expressed her opinion. And even in this case, her opinion was wrong, and it was caused a lot of problems. But and Abram, as he was known then, should not have listened to the voice of his wife. But it shows that she had some say in the marriage, obviously. Now, when did Sarah call her husband Lord? When did she refer to him as Lord? Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, 1 Peter 3:5 says. Well, there's only one place that happened on record in the Old Testament, Genesis 18:10. Abram was out there talking with the Lord and the angels, but the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Next verse, now Abram and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? She referred to him as her Lord. It was not in a setting where he was cracking the whip and demanding something from her that she didn't want to do. It was more of a term of endearment. You know, my husband, my old husband, and I'm old. I'm worn out. Can I still have pleasure? We're both old. My Lord is old. She wasn't bowing down in some inferior fashion, but she honored him. She had this attitude of heart that referred to him after all the years they'd been together. About 25 years now that they've been had left the former country and traveled together, all the memories that were built. And I'm old and my Lord is old. Her voice was heard loudly a little later on also, after Isaac was born. Genesis 21, verse 10 says, so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. He loved Ishmael. He loved Isaac, and he would have resisted in his own logic and mind and heart and everything else. Verse 12, though, says, but God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Sarah probably seemed more emotional than logical. That faith is often not logic-based. God speaks through our wives. He often uses wives to correct their husbands, to advise them, to mature them, to help them solve their problems and give them insight. And in this particular case, God just outright said, listen to your wife and do what she tells you to do. So the idea of Sarah calling her husband Lord and obeying him, there's another aspect of it too, that she still needed to listen to him, obey him when it came down to the end of the day, but God also spoke to him to listen to her. Share your heart, wives, he needs you. Ephesians 5:22 says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. But the verse right preceding that says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. A husband that will not listen to the wisdom of his wife is like a president that will not listen to the wisdom of his cabinet, make all the decisions on his own, and disaster is going to result. And so the heart of submission really for both a husband and a wife and everyone, whatever station we're at in life, is the quality of meekness. And today harkens back to my recent message, try a little meekness. I won't repeat all that message, but I will remind you that meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not mouse-like, it's militant. It's not passive, but it's aggressive. It's laying hold of God's will regarding any person or situation. And as we do that, He may direct us to defer to someone else's will, or He may direct us not to, depending on His purpose at that time for what's going on. Meekness means that we're willing to lay down our rights if God instructs us. Also means sometimes we need to claim our rights if God directs us that way. Whatever is going to result in a doorway for people to come to the Lord. It's that we're not trying to protect and defend and push our own agendas and our own ideas. What we're trying to push is whatever will push people towards Jesus. Our agenda is that they could find Christ. And if it comes through me submitting my will and putting up with something that I don't want to do, then that's what I'm going to do. But also the fact is there are people in life that should be called up short on their wrong things. We don't want to reinforce a bully. I stood up to a bully in junior high school, not because I felt like doing it. I did not want to engage him in a fist fight, but at high noon at Marvin Purdy's house across from the junior high, I did. And I kind of wish I could say I knocked him on his rear end and taught him a lesson. No, I didn't. I did give him a sore jaw. He gave me a black eye and knocked my contact off center, and I fell to the ground, probably crying. But somebody else stepped in to defend me and said, "Hey, why don't you pick on somebody your own size?" Never again did he flick my ears sitting behind me in junior high class. Never again did he direct anything cruel or aggressively against me because he was a lot bigger than me. He learned a lesson, and for his sake, he needed to learn that lesson. It took meekness for David to stand up to a bully named Goliath, but David was being meek when he did that. He was obeying what God had told him to do. If you have an abusive spouse or employer or spiritual leader, meekness may demand that you come out of your natural way of doing things and just accepting it and stand up to it. And in meekness to the will of God, which may be that you need to respond to this in a way that's going to cause them not to just continue on down that road. It's going to lead to their harm as well as many other people's destruction. If they're abusing you, they're probably going to abuse other people as well. And so one story that impacted me when I was young was a story of 5 missionaries that went to Ecuador, the Waodani tribe. They became martyrs there. They landed their plane on the sandbar, and the natives came toward them. They'd had some contact previously, but this time there had been some things stirred up, and they were on the warpath. The missionaries, they had guns, but they didn't use them. They submitted to the spears, piercing their hearts, their internal organs, and bleeding to death there in that river. But they later heard the stories as that tribe ultimately was transformed by the power of the gospel, which was demonstrated by those 5 men and their families as they'd come there. They submitted not just to being made fun of, they submitted their very bodies to spears and to dying. But as it turned out later, the ones who had been there at that scene had been participating in the murder of these 5 missionaries. They said that we heard singing. We saw bright figures above the river. We heard the sounds that we didn't recognize. Later, some of them came to the Lord. They said it was because they heard this. They weren't familiar with choirs and organized singing in their tribe. They heard the people singing at the mission, and they said that's what we heard. The angels had gathered around those missionaries to usher them home, and one of the men who had been there told the son of the man that he had murdered when he took him to that place. He said, "We heard and we saw something we didn't know it was. What they heard was the angels singing. They could have heard the gunshots ringing. Those missionaries had guns, and they could have could have killed them, but they knew that these tribesmen were not Christian. They were not aware of Jesus, and that they could go into eternity without Christ and spend eternity without Christ. They were ready to go. When people persecute us, when people wrong us, people that are we going to submit if God tells us to submit in some way to what's taking place here? Are they going to hear the angels singing in the background of our lives? Or are they going to hear the gunshots ringing? Will their hearts be impacted by the bullets of our indignation or pierced by the message of God's merciful salvation? Are we living for eternity or for this little soap bubble of time which is soon to be burst? The fruit of submission is, first of all, for our spiritual development, but second of all, for their other people's salvation. The fruit of submission. Jesus, in Matthew 16:24, told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. That's submission. That's what the cross is all about. It's submission to God's will. It's laying hold of, embracing, obeying. It's taking up that cross, not just laying down. Jesus said, nobody takes my life from me, but I lay it down. I'm going to take up his cross. Verse 24 or verse 25, whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. We think we're losing something if we don't stand up for our rights. But Jesus says, finders weepers, losers keepers. We win by surrendering, and other people win by our surrendering. Surrendering our rights, our plans, our ideas to him. Verse 27 says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. What are our petty little rights going to amount to 100 years from now? Only 4 of the 5 bodies of those missionaries that were martyred in the river there in Ecuador were recovered from the river. But there's a song that talks about something living more than just this life. The things that took place at that river were so terrible, so traumatic, so tragic, but there's a land beyond the river that we call the sweet forever, and we only reach that shore by faith's decree. One by one we'll gain the portal there to dwell with the immortals. When they ring those golden bells for you and me, for the Waidoni tribesmen that were there that day, for the people that are in our lives that may be difficult, but when they ring the golden bells, when we submit, we're saying, I want it to ring for not just me, I want it to ring for you. Don't you hear the bells now ringing? Don't you hear the angels singing? 'Tis a glory, hallelujah, jubilee. In that far-off sweet forever, just beyond the shining river, when they ring those golden bells for you and me. For me and for Minkanye and Dawe and all the other Waidoni people that came to the Lord as a result. They heard the angels singing, and they'll one day hear the angels singing in heaven because they submitted, those 5 missionaries submitted their will to the will of God.